Sandra, just sitting next to the window. I think you met her, but it's quite a while ago. So, in black, dressed in black, then yes. 26. Yeah. I haven't seen her since she was a teenager. Yeah. They change a lot at that age. Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, the car accident, yeah. Yeah, yeah. But she's pretty much okay now. She's just finishing up her degree, so it's coming back on the feet. So we're really happy about it. Yeah.
Well, should we begin? What do you think? Ready?
Leon McDuff.
Okay. All right. All right, I think it's time to begin. Welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm a professor here at the, in the Department of Humanities at SFU, and I'm also the director of the Institute for the Humanities, which is hosting this event tonight, which is a launch of Ian Angus's book, Groundwork of Phenomenological Marxism, Crisis, Body, World. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I think such an acknowledgement is of particular importance given the book's arguments, at least some of them, with respect to indigeneity and its role in confronting what Ian calls planetary technology. The format of the panel will be that our speakers will speak for about 15 or so minutes, and then there'll be a response from Ian, and then we'll open it up for discussion. There was a question about the availability of the book. Is there any kind of code?
Is there a problem with its availability? I don't.
No, in case members of the audience wish to purchase it, is there any kind of discount code they can get if they want to purchase it from the publisher? I had at least one question that came in. I didn't know how to answer that.
Not as far as I know.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
all right, we'll leave it at that.
I never thought to ask the publisher in advance, but given that they're not in town here, I don't know how we could arrange that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, let me just introduce the speakers. First and foremostly, our author, Ian Angus, is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Global Humanities. I might have said Humanities, but it's actually now Global Humanities here at SFU. He's published 10 books and edited or co-edited 5 in the areas of contemporary philosophy, Canadian studies, and communication theory. A festschrift on his work has been edited by myself and Payman Vahabzadeh, who's right over there in the audience. Say hello, Payman. Payman's right there. That's entitled Crossing Borders, Essays in Honor of Ian Angus, Beyond Phenomenology and Critique. Andrew Feenberg, sitting to my immediate right, served as the Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Technology in the School of Communication, also here at SFU. He served as a directeur de programme at the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris. His books include Questioning Technology, Transforming Technology, Heidegger and Marcuse, Between Reason and Experience, The Philosophy of Praxis, and Technosystem, The Social Life of Reason. His forthcoming book is entitled The Ruthless Critique of Everything Existing, Nature and Revolution in Marcuse's Philosophy of Praxis. And last but not least, appearing via technology at some point, is Glen Coulthard, who is a Yellowknives Dene and an associate professor in First Nations and Indigenous Studies program and the Departments of Political Science, and the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. He's, of course, author of Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition, and a co-founder of the Dihinta Center for Research and Learning, a decolonial indigenous land-based post-secondary program operating on his traditional territories in Denade, Northwest Territories. In fact, that's where he is right now and has to beam in. He is hopefully going to be with us. He did mention that there were certain community issues that he was attending to. So we'll just have to see and play it by ear, but hopefully he will be with us. So the order of presentation will be that I will go first, then I'll turn it over to Andrew, and then we will hopefully hear from Glen. So just by way of a brief preface to my remarks, what I try to do in them is to kind of situate the relationship a little bit between phenomenology and Marxism, provide some, let's say, flavor of the arguments that Ian has presented in this extremely rigorous, intricately argued, and I think quite brilliant text. I can only very briefly scratch the surface, present some of my reflections and critical commentary on it in the hope of initiating a dialogue and opening up for discussion. But it really, there's only so much one can do with a book of this quality and of this magnitude. So that's the real caveat in what I wanted to say by way of a preface. So, phenomenology and Marxism appear to be rather strange bedfellows. Phenomenology is guided by Edmund Husserl's slogan, back to the things themselves, and the to which Husserl refers isn't the sensuous manifold of empiricism, but rather the subjective performances of meaning intention and meaning fulfillment. There is no such thing as detached consciousness as such. Rather, consciousness is to be understood as intentional, that is, always already directed towards objects. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. What is meant by Marxism is much less clear. Is it, for example, grounded in the Hegelian, Feuerbachian humanist writings of the early Marx, emphasizing an immanent logic to history that Hegel once understood as characterized by the ruse of reason, a kind of immanent eschatology? As Marx puts it in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, quote, "Communism is the riddle of history solved and knows itself to be the solution," end quote. Or is it an elaboration of Marx's later attempt to derive the logic of the essence of capital, understood as self-valorizing value, from its surface appearance, of the world as a vast accumulation of commodities, which is to say, Marxism as a critique of political economy? Despite the differences between phenomenology and Marxism, there have been several attempts to forge syntheses between them, particularly in the aftermath of the collapse of the Second Socialist International, with the voting of war credits in the run-up to the First World War, and then in the aftermath of the crushing of the German Revolution in the wake of the Russian Revolution. As Walter Benjamin, among others, have observed, the Second International's dogmatic and mechanical Marxism was partially responsible for the defeat of the workers' movement and the corresponding rise of fascism. A crucial first step towards an encounter between phenomenology, with its emphasis on consciousness and meaning, and Marxism, with its emphasis on the abstract nature of domination within capitalism, was taken by Hungarian philosopher and writer Georg Lukács in his 1923 History and Class Consciousness, in particular its central essay, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, which addressed the crisis of subjectivity as a result of what he called reification, which we can understand in shorthand terms as the spatialization of time. As Lucien Goldman sought to show, Martin Heidegger's 1927 Being in Time was an ontological response to what Lukács had defined as a historical problem of reification, grounded in an analysis of the commodity form and its fetishism in the fourth section of Chapter 1, Volume 1 of Capital. In other words, even before a synthesis had been attempted, phenomenology and Marxism were already engaged in a kind of Auseinandersetzung, which is to say, a critical yet productive dialogue. Since then, phenomenology and Marxism have come into ever closer proximity in the work of Herbert Marcuse, Jean-Paul Sartre, Ludwig Landgrebe, Jan Patočka, Enzo Paci, and we might also add the late founder of the American journal Telos, Paul Piccone, who co-translated and introduced Paci's The Function of Science and the Meaning of Man. On the one hand, phenomenology, like psychoanalysis, offers Marxism a richer account of subjectivity, meaning, and value, which had been relegated, as per the base superstructure metaphor that Marx introduced in his preface to the Critique of Political Economy, to the status of mere epiphenomenon. Marxism, on the other hand, offered phenomenology an account of the meaningful background horizon of the life world, grounded in a more robust historical understanding of the social and ontological nature of labor. According to Brian Smith and Richard Westerman, there have been three types of encounters between phenomenology and Marxism. The first is a Marxist interpretation of Husserl's crisis, quote, identifying the domination of abstract rationality as one of the key problems of capitalism and responsible for inhibiting the fullest development of human potential, end quote. The second is located in parallels between Marx's radical left Hegelian account of the importance of labor in the manuscripts and Heidegger's account of practical comportment in being and time, with the ontological reorientation of phenomenology that it implies. Third are the existentialist interpretations of phenomenology that resonated with Marxism, here too, especially as expressed in the manuscripts, with respect to alienation as both subjective experience and as an objective social pathology. Ian Angus's truly magisterial Groundwork for Phenomenological Marxism, Crisis Body World, clearly falls into the first category, which is to say a Marxian interpretation of Husserl's phenomenological account of the crisis of the European sciences. The question, of course, immediately arises as to why we might need a phenomenological Marxism for our own time. And isn't such a project obviated or thwarted by the fact that since the 1960s, particularly in France, phenomenology has been mercilessly attacked by structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers, such as Althusser, Foucault, Barthes, and others who have confidently announced the death of the subject? Or could it be that this very attack on subjectivity is precisely why it is necessary to return to questions of meaning and value, once again, amidst the proliferating nihilism of our present? Nihilism understood specifically as the idea that the highest values devalue themselves, as Nietzsche says in Will to Power. The answer as to why we might need such a Marxism is, I think, given in the first two parts of the book, to which I shall mostly confine my remarks. Part one, Angus shows that Husserl's crisis is fundamentally about a crisis of reason. The crisis of reason, according to Husserl, has to do with the fact that the sciences abstract from the very human meaning in which they find their origins and upon which they continue to rely. In contrast to sociological accounts of the crisis of reason, as in, for example, Max Weber's account of disenchantment, which leads to a kind of pessimistic decisionism about ends, phenomenology contains a healing power which entails an uncovering of the historical sedimentation of mathematical reason. In the process of such an uncovering, it is able, or so it claims, to recover value. Husserl's account of the crisis of reason, qua logic of mathematization, could be said to provide resources with which to think the form of digitality, in particular the predominance of the algorithm, which, like Galilean science, both relies on but also extracts from human experience and meaning, and becomes the transcendental or necessary and seemingly inescapable horizon of our times. The algorithm is the updated version of what Marcuse referred to as a technological a priori lying at the heart of one-dimensional society, or what Horkheimer and Adorno call the culture industry. In part two, Angus shows us precisely why phenomenological Marxism is necessary through a detailed discussion of such a logic, and how it accelerates and deepens through the digitalization of culture, insofar as it, quote, collapses both knowledge into the form of information and communication into the form of information. such that information is both knowledge and its communication. Angus goes on to state, information is the cultural definition of the digitalization of culture that raises the question of whether information provokes a crisis for culture by undermining an integration of reason with meaning and value. Yet, and I shall come back to this point a bit later, I wonder why Angus doesn't examine the way in which digitalization doesn't just constitute a crisis of culture, but also a crisis of labor in which such culture is grounded. So as I see it, the crux of the argument of the first two parts of the book is as is signified by the first two words in the subtitle, crisis and body, have to do with the parallel between Husserl and Marx, and whose work can be discerned a certain shared normative commitment to differentiated community, but which is obscured by the mathematization of nature, hence its estrangement from meaning and value in Husserl, and the social representation of value as price in Marx. Angus's encounters with Husserl and Marx can be considered then to be determinate negations, simultaneous cancelling and preserving of aspects of both the crisis of the European sciences and capital, leading in the direction of a synthesis that constitutes the groundwork signified by the first word of the book's title. Just as Husserl's answer to the crisis of grounding meaning in the science of the life world fails, Marx is unable to properly ground his implicit ontology of labor in a thematized understanding of the surplus productivity of nature. Marx's implicit ontology is not sufficient because it ultimately, in Angus's view, relies on an unacknowledged surplus productivity, or what he calls fecundity, of nature itself. And in the crucial chapter 7, Angus deals with what he calls Husserl's third innovation, which is a shift from a science of the ontology of the life world, within which meaning can be grounded, to a shift of a science of the life world to an ontology of the life world, which introduces the idea of the experience of the motility of the living body. This then sets up a subsequent discussion in the remainder of the book of such a phenomenology and the ontology of labor, and finally opens up a consideration of ecology and the confrontation between planetary technology on the one hand and situated indigeneity on the other. Now, in my brief and woefully inadequate summary of such an intricately detailed and rigorous argument, two questions present themselves. And I really do mean this. I mean, I think it would take at least a year-long seminar to go through the enormous complexity and rigor of the arguments you set out in this book. So I really, feel that this is a very difficult task to elucidate some of the arguments and pose some critical questions. But here goes. The first question is whether in Marx's implicit ontology of labor one can locate an elision of the very surplus productivity of nature, or fecundity, that both accounts for the surplus productivity of nature and, even more importantly, and this is the crucial point, exceeds capitalist reason. Doesn't Marx at least gesture towards such surplus productivity of nature in his critique of the Gotha program? In his very first remark on the first part of the opening paragraph, that, quote, labor is the source of all wealth and culture, Marx claims quite trenchantly that labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and it is surely of such that material wealth consists as labor, which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. So here Marx notes that not only are labor and nature the sources of wealth, but also that labor power ought to be thought of as a force of nature. Moreover, the description of what he calls the superhuman creative power, this is a kind of the Prometheanism that Marx is often charged with, this superhuman creative power as belonging to labor alone is, in Marx's view, a fundamentally bourgeois idea. And he states, and I quote, the bourgeois have very good grounds for falsely ascribing supernatural creative power to labor, since precisely from the fact that labor depends on nature, it follows that the man who possesses no other property than his labor power must, in all conditions of society and culture, be the slave of other men who have made themselves the owners of the material conditions of labor. He can only work with their permission, hence live only with their permission, end quote. One way that this statement has been understood in interpretations of Marx is that Marx doesn't presuppose an ontology of labor at all, but rather challenges the usefulness of a transhistorical category of labor. The domination of abstract labor under capitalism is what Adorno was referring to when he called Marx's Capital the phenomenology of the anti-spirit and the ontology of the wrong state of things. What Adorno was referring to, in other words, was the advent under the rule of capital of an abstract form of domination in the very form of value understood as socially necessary labor, which comes to mediate all of our relations within the totality of the specific form of society. Adorno's reading of Marx would give rise to what's called value form theory, and such a theory has been powerfully articulated in the work of Moïse Postone, which has been particularly influential in articulating an opposition to what he calls traditional Marxism, or what Heinrich calls worldview Marxism, which is understood as a falsely grounded critique of abstract labor, the dominant form of social mediation in the standpoint of concrete, embodied, use-value producing labor. For Postone, the fundamental contradiction in capitalism is not class conflict between bourgeois and proletarian, or that between the productive forces and relations of production, but rather the way in which under capitalism wealth is expressed as value, or again, socially necessary labor time, objectified, and commodity. Postone's understanding of the contradiction between value on the one hand and wealth on the other reiterates Marx's observation of the increasing share played by fixed capital at the expense of variable capital in the valorization process, in the so-called fragment on machines, in the Grundrisse. And this is no surprise, as Postone's reconstruction of Marx's critical theory is based centrally on a reading of the Grundrisse. There in the last pages of Notebook 6 and in the first pages of Notebook 7, Marx writes, quote, "The development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. To what degree the powers of social production have been produced not only in the form of knowledge, but also as immediate organs of social practice of the real life process. Here we might substitute information for knowledge." Along similar lines, Postone argues that with the increasing use of technology to increase relative over surplus value extraction, firms are able in the short term to increase profits from such increases in productivity. However, over the long term, as other firms catch up, profitability decreases with the overall decrease in the exploitation of labor. In other words, labor plays an ever-diminishing role in the valorization process. And this means there can be a diminution of value, again, socially necessary labor time, yet with an increase in wealth. This then helps to account for the increasing role of digital technology in production process through, for example, robotics, AI, machine learning, and of course, algorithms. It would then seem that an ontology of labor would be hard-pressed to address the possibility of the obsolescence of labor itself. However, if we leave value form theory's skepticism with respect to the necessity of an ontology of labor aside, and agree that not only is an ontology of labor possible, but also necessary for Marx's critique of capital, I wonder if an account of the being of labor requires consideration of its material reproduction. That is to say, ought not such an ontology of labor, as Marxist feminist Tithi Bhattacharya puts it, requires asking the following question. If the laborer produces the commodity, then who produces the labor? This clearly takes the form, of course, of biological reproduction, which is the origin of the word fecundity, but it also opens up questions of the manner in which the reproduction of labor is historical, or what we could call perhaps a natural historical process, through which labor is reproduced via forms of slavery, indentured servitude, forced migration, immigration, and so forth. This then raises questions of the racialized and gendered nature of such labor. These have come to form important questions for contemporary biopolitics and demographic anxieties that profoundly animate the far right in our era. Can an ontology of labor address these historical contingencies? Reproduction can also, in a way, be considered from within the phenomenological tradition via Hannah Arendt, who makes natality central to her understanding of the political. Just as for Angus, the fecundity of nature represents an excess that exceeds capitalist reason, so for Arendt does natality make possible a new beginning, a new temporal sequence. Thanks very much.
Okay, does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Ian Angus's Groundwork of Phenomenological Marxism renews a trend that was influential in the 1960s and 70s. Phenomenology played a role in the Marxism of Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Marcuse, and many others. Edmund Husserl developed phenomenology as a descriptive science of lived experience, the so-called life world. These phenomenological Marxists, writing at a time of rising social conflict, argued that Marxism required a comparable theory, a theory of the life world, to explain the revolution in consciousness happening around them. Angus's goal is to, quote, develop a phenomenological Marxism adequate to the cultural and ecological crisis of the 21st century, end quote. His approach is based on a critique of formalism in science and social life. Both Marx and Husserl contrast lived experience with the formalized order of modern society. The task is to recover the meanings born by experience in the face of the all-conquering abstractions of capitalist modernity. In this talk, I will articulate Angus's approach with Lukács's critique of reification, which underlies my own work on science and technology. Reification refers to the reduction of social relations to things, the Latin res, that is, to impersonal interactions mediated by law-like social systems. The model for reification in this sense is the reduction of the social relation between producers and consumers to the exchange of money for goods on the market. The parallel Angus identifies between formalism in science, that's Husserl's argument, and economics, that's Marx's, can be extended to Lukács's generalized critique of reified rationality. Angus's groundwork is based on a crucial equivalence. He relates Husserl's critique of what Husserl calls Galilean science to Marx's critique of political economy. Galileo reduced nature to measurable quantities, and Marx observed the reduction of the use value of commodities to market prices. Such formal abstractions must be distinguished from generalizations. A generalization merely classifies objects under an abstract category, whereas formalization strips its objects of all their qualities except a single one relevant to a science. The concept of city can serve as an example of a generalization. The content of this abstract category can be filled in by reference to Paris, New York, etc. These are all cities. The meaning of city is enriched by the concrete content of these examples, and vice versa. The examples gain general attributes from the concept of city. Generalizations such as this are part of everyday language. In modern times, experts have learned to use another type of abstraction, the formal abstractions which enter into scientific formulae. Formalization consists in selecting a specific aspect of a concrete object and treating it within a formal system as a variable, an X of a certain type. The variable fills out abstract mathematical or geometrical forms with specific real-world contents that are narrowed down and emptied of meaning. These empty variables select a specific perspective on the concrete object suitable for processing in a scientific formula. The reason why I make a point of this distinction, which Angus develops in his book, is because both Husserl and Marx produce a critique of formalized sciences, whether it's physics or political economy. In each case, it's a formalized science and has specific properties that are shared between them that belong to the notion of formal rationality. So here's an example. For example, the formula distance equals velocity times time gains no content from the specific distances calculated with the formula. In this case, the x, the variable, is a number, such as 1 mile, 200 yards, etc. Distances in this sense are mere measures that differ only quantitatively. The meaningful content available in the life world as one traverses a distance is wholly lost. Think of the difference between the rich experience of a walk through Paris and the image shown on the GPS of a taxi cab. The modern world is based on such formalizations in both science and economics. They give control with a consequent loss of the meanings and values present in concrete social life. Modernity depends on formalization, exemplified by both natural science and political economy. Just as perceptual objects are processed in the equations of physics, so goods are reduced to their price as commodities and subjected to the order of the market. Marx and Husserl deplore the consequences of such formalizations, but without abandoning science. Husserl's solution is a refoundation of natural science on the basis of its sources in the life world. Marx projects a socialist economy that would restore the potency of the concrete use values obscured by the tyranny of the market. Angus writes, quote, "It is a convergence on a historical form dominated by formal reason, whose critique demands that the presupposed life world, or use, becomes newly central to philosophy. Philosophy can no longer be mesmerized by the attractions of abstraction, but must turn to address the role of abstractions in the lived world and their origin from that world," end quote. It is by no means clear how this is supposed to work. Husserl, no more than Marx, can explain the new dispensation that restores the concrete. Their theories share a common vagueness when it comes to the solution to the problem of formalization they identify. In the case of Marxist theory, this became all too clear with the failure of the Soviet planned economy that was supposed to restore the primacy of use value, but instead created all sorts of unintended consequences. So the dilemma these guys have, according to Angus, is that they want to preserve science. They're not against science. On the other hand, they want to somehow connect it up with the concrete life world, but they don't really have a way of doing it. Angus relates the concept of formalization to modern technology, which, like science and the market, is alienated from its origin and consequences in the life world. What might be called practical formalization consists in narrowing each technique down to its purely functional aspect with respect to a single end, regardless of its relation to other aspects of the life world context to which it belongs. Just as the objects of theory are emptied out of concrete content, stripped down to their function within a formal system, so technologies are designed only under the aspect that enables them to function within the immediate technical system to which they belong. Where the wider social and natural context is ignored, the result, not surprisingly, is a mismatch between technologies and the world they inhabit. Angus writes, quote, "Formalization in theory becomes one-dimensionality in practice," end quote. Environmental disaster is the most familiar such mismatch today. But already in the 19th century, Marx found evidence of similar problems in the occupational hazards and illnesses suffered by industrial workers and the destruction of the soil by capitalist farming. This concept of technological formalization can be extended in terms of Lukács's concept of reification. Reification characterizes commodity fetishism and industrial technology, as Marx argued, but also bureaucracy, as Weber conceives it. Lukács touches on the implications of reification for technical disciplines, such as journalism and law. Today, it is necessary to extend the concept of reification to all the technical disciplines, bureaucracies, and technologies that structure a modern society. I have called this the technosystem in my book of that title. In Marx's day, only factories, armies, and shipping were based on technology in something like the modern sense. Today, everything from childcare to communication has its bureaucratic order. Bureaucracy and technology are closely aligned in modern capitalism. So here is my basic argument. Bureaucratic systems depend on rules and regulations imposed on a population assembled by technologies conceived in accordance with formalized technical disciplines. In advanced capitalist society, bureaucracies, like technologies, have a narrow focus and so can be analyzed as quasi-formal systems. This narrowing is determined by the socially embedded technical disciplines that inform bureaucratic practice. The definition of their objects is decontextualized and standardized in accordance with a goal. An object, such as crime, child welfare, educational achievement, can be formalized in many different ways by the technical disciplines that study them. And each definition has different theoretical and practical consequences. So if you want to know, for example, if a professor is a good professor, there's a technical discipline that'll help you find out. It'll measure the number of citations. So that's one way of doing it, formalized way of doing it. But of course you could imagine other ways. I mean, you could look at student evaluations. There are many different formal systems you could construct by which to quantify the value of a professor's work. Each one has different theoretical and practical consequences. The bureaucratic object is a human being stripped bare of horizon and background, and most of its qualities, just like the objects of science and technology. The impoverished content of the bureaucratic object, its remaining quality, allows it to be contextualized within the logic of a more or less formalized system. Angus writes, quote, "The client of a bureaucracy is in principle a formalism. In practice, it is an adumbrated technique," end quote. By this he means that entering bureaucratic systems such as universities, medical institutions, social service institutions, cuts the individual off from the full complexity of their life in order to fit into a formal system. The bureaucratic reduction of the individual to a case, that's what bureaucracies treat, not persons but cases. This is a kind of algebraic X, resembles the way markets reduce commodities to prices and workers to labor power. For example, the writer is an abstract category for the experts who organize transportation for a city. The category writer is no more rich in content than the category velocity in physics or profit in political economy, and like them, it can be treated mathematically. Writers are characterized by where they get on and off and by their numbers at various times and places. As a writer on the bus system, one appears as an abstract element, tracked by a pass and measured and plugged into a logistics algorithm. Stripped down to what the pass reveals, writers fill out the X of the system variable. With this information to hand, experts can make calculations. That's the formalization, to optimize the system in accordance with the goal of moving people from place to place by the shortest route at the least cost. Each technical discipline involved in structuring the modern world has a specific object that orients its expert personnel. The larger issue of the meaning and value of the activities the experts organize may be lost in the labor of one-dimensional optimization. But on occasion, decisions need to be made that are not immanent to the system as it stands. For example, decisions on the relative use of the roads for buses, cars, and bicycles. Those decisions will decide the nature of the city as both an object of the discipline of urban planning and as a concrete experience for its citizens. What is a city? Is it a flux of commercial traffic or a place of human interaction and encounter? That choice is technically underdetermined, and so politics must intervene. Here, different types of actors engage around the concrete life worlds they prefer. The dominant actors, automobile companies and drivers of cars, press for their priorities, while new actors ask for more public transport and bicycle lanes. There is no possible formalization of this dispute. It is carried on discursively with those advocating for the established system, basing themselves on the facts, what they call the facts, while the others bring forward what Marcuse would have called potentialities. The question in dispute is the concrete nature of the city. That question will be decided in part by the nature of the transportation system, and that decision will be essentially political. There are two different definitions of the city, and each will determine an expert response. The city as object of a technical discipline is constructed in the course of public debate over the concrete idea of the city. In each case, the object, the city, is different. The corresponding engineering and laws are different, and the life world is also different. What is true of the city in this example is also true of the industrial system as a whole in its relation to nature. Hence the significance of the environmental movement, which aims not to eliminate industry, but to transform it. The transformation of the energy system under public pressure to contain climate change is an example of this dynamic. The objects of the technical disciplines are designed relative to a purpose and can be redesigned for a changed purpose. There are no fixed essences and no imperatives of technology, but only variant designs. The innovations proposed by social movements are incorporated into reform systems based on different formalizations. A democratized form of modernity would favor the recursive interaction between formal systems and the life world. The resulting reforms would be within the framework of modernity while giving it a non-capitalist direction. The problem is thus not theoretical formalization as such, but the one-dimensional consequences of its practical instances under capitalism. If formalizations could be seen not as ontological truths, but as practical tools in a context aiming at wider goals consonant with the complexity of the life world, they could be integrated to a two-dimensional world. And this, I think, is the goal and the purpose of Ian Angus's book.
So, I think we're still waiting for Glen's arrival. So maybe what we should do now is for you, Ian, to begin with some remarks, some response, and then we'll see where Glen is. Hopefully he'll be able to join us.
Okay. First, I would like to thank the people who have come out tonight and the people who are watching, if there are any, on the live feed. I'm committed at bottom to the notion that these are important questions, and I've done my best to address them, and I'm hoping that others will do so also. I'm very lucky to have three, or at least so far two, but I hope three, because I want to hear what Glen has to say as well. Deep readers of the text, people who perceived, I think, what its intentions were. And this isn't always the case, of course. And so I'm very thankful for the comments and for the dialogue that they provoke. If it would be all right with you, I think I would like to begin with Andrew's questions because they might flow more naturally back into the ones that you raised, Samir. Both commentators point out that the phenomenological Marxism had its heyday in the 1960s with the work of Enzo Paci and so many others. And that is true. And I think both of them also pointed out that since then a lot has happened, and that was of course, very much on my mind in writing the book, that I couldn't simply just repeat a position, not taking into consideration both the changes in society and history and so forth, but also some of the valid theoretical critiques that have been made of the period at that time. The critique of the subject, which was, in some sense, one hates to say this about people of the caliber of Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Paci, but was somewhat naively assumed as a foundation, has been pretty rigorously attacked by post-structuralisms and so on, and Nietzschean-inspired thought, to the point where one really has to think very carefully about what you might mean by a subject and what you might ascribe to it. So I think that in that respect, in that historical respect, one of the key aspects of the book is the distinction, which in strict Husserlian terms is between the concrete ego and the transcendental ego. The concrete ego being, people like you and me, and so forth, and the transcendental ego, who knows what, right? So there's a long argument in the book that the transcendental ego is not an ego. And I use the term simply transcendentality as a realm of experience to which we all have some sort of access. Now, how and why and what that means, and let me leave that aside for the moment. But I do think that the concrete subject is thoroughly constituted by various forms of social, economic, historical forces. So it's not a return to phenomenological Marxism of the 1960s, 70s in that sense. So what then? One of the key aspects of any kind of, as Andrew very clearly pointed out, of any kind of attempt at a rapport between Marxism and phenomenology is some kind of attempt to recover the concrete. Concrete experience and the legitimacy of concrete experience. And I think that you can probably all fill in, without me going on for a long time about it, about all the sorts of historical experiences which are differentiated by race and sex and class and so forth, that make us see the world in different ways. So we can't have a return to the concrete that assumes a subject that somehow doesn't have any of these characteristics or things. The question then is, well, what can we have? One thing that we might think we can have to have, and I think that there's a whole strain of thought coming out of France, but mostly under the influence of Michel Foucault, that says you can't have any general theory of it at all. You have only specific localized theories, that's all that you can have. And I don't think that's going to be good enough, to put it boldly. The restoration of the concrete, it seems to me, has to have some kind of general justification, not just ones related to the specific concerns that people have. For it to be related to a large-scale political project for which we may have hopes, and for which people put themselves on the line, but which at times looks very beleaguered these days. What sense can there be a return of the concrete? Well, I suggest in the book that both the idea of use in Marx and the idea of the individual and that means not the individual person, but the individual experience of some kind, in Husserl, assume a kind of self-evidence, which doesn't pertain. So there's an assumption, I think, in Marx's idea of communism, for example. The notion is with the critique of value. Value is a form of comparison or homogenization between different kinds of commodities, which are ultimately different kinds of values, right? So that because everything we produce and everything we value occurs through a kind of a calculation machine that says this one is worth 3 times that because this is worth $100, that's worth $300, to put it boldly. We then, if we're going to critique that, which I think both Marxism and phenomenology do, there seems to be the sense at which we just get each thing for itself. And that some kind of authenticity would have been the word in the 1960s, consists in just everything being taken on its own terms. Now, it seems to me that any kind of modern society, and I would argue, given the chance, any kind of society must kind of equate things in some way. There is some, in other words, society is some kind of a system. It doesn't have to be a formalized system, but it's some kind of a system. So communism could not be the regime of use, or as I put it in another place, there is no regime of use. There is no organized system which just consists of individual specific things taken on their own terms. So what have you got then? Well, I suggest in the book, and Andrew talked about this for a while because he's developed the same kind of an idea. I really think it is a very compatible idea with the argument that he gave you at the end about social movements and the reform of sciences. Where was I? There was a beginning to that sentence. I argue in the book that the individual cannot be found by, sort of in itself on its own, as it were, but that every perception of any individual, and there's a kind of analysis of perception behind this, you can see an individual as an individual insofar as it stands out from a background, right? There's a whiteness around it, not a table because that's another individual, right? But a whiteness surrounds this pen, and that whiteness grades off into some indefinite horizon, which is the origin of the concept of world in Husserl and essentially in Heidegger as well. So I'm suggesting essentially in the book that there is, if you work with these terms, which I try to do, that through an individual being seen in relation to a background and horizon, you get a kind of incipient ecological conception of perception. And that is where one, excuse me, that's where one could find individuals in a way that isn't subject to the post-structuralist critique. So yes, I absolutely agree with the argument that Andrew put forward, that through these life-world experiences that are manifested to us in various kinds, the multiplicity of social movements that are always going on in contemporary society, they are, in effect, forcing formalized systems to account for concrete experiences. And through that can develop a process of reform which doesn't sort of seem to head off to a utopia of everything on its individual side, probably would have to be a process of continuous reform and continuous thought, but that it does mean that one can both inhabit a modern world with these formalized systems, as you argue, and at the same time still be an active subject, and act with other active subjects, acting upon that world and not just cases or patients or, categories that fit into the formal system. So that's the kind of argument, and I hope that putting it that way, you see some parallelism between the Marxist and phenomenological aspects of it, which to me became much and much stronger as I read the book. I made that claim about Marx's critique of political economy and Husserl's critique of European sciences as having exactly the same formal structure I would have never thought to say that. In fact, if anybody had said it to me for many years, I would have thought, ooh, that's a bit too much. But I really think that that is the case once you parse out all the little pieces of it. So, yeah, one of the main linkages then, as Samir pointed out, is at the beginning of the part 3 of the book, but the second main argument of the book, where Husserl's conception of the kinesthetic body is connected to Marx's ontology of labor. And it is indeed a good question whether Marx had an ontology of labor, and a lot of people say he didn't. When you laid out 2 questions, by the way, I didn't get clear about where one became 2, but I think I did get all the pieces, so you can tell me if I'm going wrong here. So Samir asked, is there an illusion of the fecundity of nature in Marx, which is a key assertion in my text? Well, you can pick the critique of Gotha program in which he says certain things about nature, and Marx said a lot of different things about nature, actually. So one of the questions that's raised here, and this is a tricky one for anybody who wants to lean on Marx in these days, how are you reading Marx, and why are you reading him that way, and what are you trying to get out of it? I pretty much center my reading of Marx on the first volume of Capital, but not entirely. I do draw in a few other things, including the critique of the Gotha program in certain places. And my argument about his eliding the fecundity of nature begins from suggesting that he actually elides the fecundity of labor. In the chapter 7 of the first volume of Capital, where he lays out in very adumbrated form his ontology of labor, or at least so I claim it's an ontology of labor, as a relation between humans through technology to nature, such that humans are transformed, technology is transformed, and nature is transformed. It's a thoroughly dialectical circle in Marx's early work. In 1844, he already said that, but it was framed as a circle, a continuous dialectical transformation of all parts. In Capital, Volume 1, he focuses in on technology, and I won't go much into detail about it, but technology interrupts the circle there, and it shows why history must enter into this relationship. So it's not a self-confirming circle, it's something which takes on diverse kinds of forms. Now, Marx does this purely as a kind of an aside in about 2 or 3 pages. And if you haven't read all the earlier work, you probably miss the depth of what's being asserted. He then goes, I should finish relatively soon, but he goes on. He inserts that in order to talk about where surplus value comes from, how it can be that people sell their labor, they get paid at its value, and yet nevertheless there is a surplus which is taken by the capitalist class. And if you recall that, you will see that that's only possible if humans produce more than they consume. There is what's called in Marxist terminology a surplus productivity. But that surplus productivity is not accounted for in his ontology of labor. So that was the thread I started pulling. And the more I pulled that thread, the more it seemed to me, yeah, that's true. And not only that, if you look at the 3rd volume of Capital, where he talks about landed property and agricultural land, you see that the surplus productivity of labor is only possible because there is already a surplus productivity in nature. So I call one surplus productivity, the other natural fecundity, and at times I squash the both together because I suggest that this is part of our natural condition, is that we have this thing which in fact the whole rest of nature has. So that's the way in which the ontology of labor becomes an ontology in some sense. I smash them together in the concept of excess. Nature, including us as part of nature, always overflows itself. It never reproduces itself. Well, it always reproduces itself and some more, and something more, right? And I think that's, from the viewpoint of Marxism, the most important thing that I come up with. Now, what is Marxism, though? Yes, you can find other places where he says other things, but I think, you see, and a lot of this, you're right, the value form people do a lot of reading of Grundrisse. Now, Grundrisse is a very interesting text, also very, very long and very kind of confused as well. However, there is no concept of value in Grundrisse. Marx discovered the concept of value that structures at its core capital after the notebooks that are Grundrisse. So to go to Grundrisse to solve these problems, to me, is just wrong. And could say more about that, but that's why I just kind of pushed that off the table. So there are people like Adorno, Postone, and Heinrich, who suggest that there is no ontology of labor in Marx. Now, it seems to me that you can only critique capital as a form of the appropriation of surplus if you have a way of understanding the production of surplus. And the production of surplus, no Marxist ever suggested, is unique to capitalism. It begins at the very beginning of human history and has the basis for every form of class society. So if you don't want to call it an ontology, you have to suggest that it is transhistorical at least, and that transhistorical characteristic, which is, he mentioned some, but not, it seems to me, the key ones, interestingly enough, in Capital, that transhistorical characteristic is the very condition for the critique of capitalism. So I won't say any more about that other than to say, for me, that's pretty much sufficient for calling it an ontology, which is to say a condition of being that we necessarily inhabit as natural beings on planet Earth. Yes, there are implications for human reproduction about this, which actually really only occurred to me after the book. And I did wonder, because I followed all those debates about wages for housework and so on in the 1980s, and lots of other things like that. And I think it could be, I think something could be done, but I haven't done it. You're welcome to have a go if you'd like to. I'll stop there.
Good. All right, so we're still waiting for Glen to make an appearance. He well might not, so I think we should just open it up. But before we do, I just want to mention that after we finish here, people shouldn't go running off because there's going to be a reception held somewhere out there. So stick around for that. So yeah, I'll open it up for questions, comments, polemics. Hilda? Yeah, please. Is there a microphone? Yeah. Yeah, so that way you'll get on the feed.
I don't think it's on.
I think it is.
Now it's on.
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. And it's so good to be back in this type of events. I have a series of questions because I'm also very interested in this problem of surplus value. But I first wanted to sort of interject a critique into psychoanalysis. I'm a practitioner of psychoanalysis and also a geographer. So now I can say that, but sort of incorporating a critique to psychoanalysis, particular the one that you were mentioning, and it kind of transpired in the three presentations about post-structuralism and how that sort of tends to especially academic Lacanian psychoanalysis, I'm a Lacanian psychoanalyst, could practice with life experience with beings that are suffering and enjoying, and how that can be extracted, that sort of the theory can extract the lived experience, and particularly with regards to the problems of ecology, can become a little bit cynical or come across as cynical if we don't introduce the lived experience, or what we would call in Lacanian psychoanalysis the imaginary. It's almost like we need to recuperate, and I have been writing about this thing, particularly with regards to technologies or the hyper acceleration of the digital, that the embodiment is in a great part of the imaginary, and psychoanalysis needs to put this critique that you are bringing about phenomenology into incorporating in the way it is transmitted. That's why the clinical psychoanalysis is needed in the academia. The second point about Lukács and this, I really always like how Andrew communicates the theory of Lukács with clarity about the case, the abstraction of the cases versus the cases. And I just thought about the movie, What is the Value of Life, or what Life is Worth, is about the insurance kind of cases after 9/11. It's a Hollywood movie, but it's a good one, about how precisely that question came about, and it was resolved by trying to rather than qualify kind of people, right, instead of cases. Finally, my question to Ian about surplus value. I really think that we are sort of thinking, or I'm thinking with you, and also from Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, the excess of the psychic energy. So yeah, it's the natural fecundity, and also the psychic kind of excess of, we call it jouissance, or the enjoyment, right? Like the suffering, the pleasure, the complication of sexuality, etc. So my question to you is, I can't wait to read your book, of course, but how are you managing, or how are you kind of conceptualizing the expenditure and residue in sort of the system of fecundity? Because I think that aspect of qualitative nature is important for this ontology that you are proposing, I imagine, right? Like how it is kind of spent, and what are the residues of that. So that's it. Thank you.
You could respond to the questions.
Well, I could say something about the notion that we can quantify the value of human lives. If the movie says you can't, then I agree with the movie. Not everything can be treated in a formal system. The formal systems are subsets of much vaster realities that, and I think that's part of what the argument really is about. One of the problems that Ian's book addresses is the limits of formalism. The fact that you can't put everything into a formal system. There needs to be some kind of, at the very least, interaction between different formal systems, so you can get more of a sense of the context and background that is actually part of everyday life, of the life world. So the danger is thinking that the formal system can be an ultimate ontology, that it can tell you what the nature of reality is, and without remainder. And if you think that, then you end up with, the notion, for example, that everything can be reduced to physics. It can all be reduced somehow to some natural phenomenon, and then that eliminates completely the notion of human agency. And then from there you can easily get to the notion that it all ought to be managed somehow by, for example, artificial intelligence will take care of it. So there's a series of reductions that finally result in absurdity. At least we should be able to observe its absurdity. But the alternative is to not view the formal systems as telling you the ultimate nature of reality, but as tools. They're mediations, tools that you can use in the context of a larger understanding of life. And in that way, I think they can become part of a more democratic form of life that we would like to enjoy in a modern society.
Enjoyment is always excessive.
Well, I meant enjoyment in the the mundane sense. Yeah. So anyway, that's some comments on your question.
Yeah, I would say that there's a price put on human life every day by insurance companies. And it's not that it can't be done, it's being done all the time. It's that it misses something. And it's up to everybody to point out and to push against what is being missed. It's not that there's this pure world anywhere, you know, that can't be touched, unfortunately. So this is related to the ontology that I really only get to a little bit in the book and haven't elaborated to my own satisfaction. But I'm suggesting, I think from what I said before, this should be clear, that every individual that expresses an excess does so because of the power of the world around it, the background, and the horizon, the horizon of the world, which comes up through the individual. And so that is the excess. Excess is always emerging through individuals in the world. Now, what that means, there is a relationship to psychoanalysis here, but again, that's something I have only some initial thoughts about. But consciousness is in this sense, a formal system, which enables a structuring by pushing certain things out, right? We have to, in order for us to live in this ordinary world that we live in, we have to forget our dreams. We have to forget all of the jouissance. We have to ignore all of that for the ordinary functioning to occur. And that is a reification. And so in that sense, the job of the analyst is precisely the same as the job of the phenomenologist and the Marxist, I think, which is to find, you know, a person comes to an analyst because the formal system isn't working, right? It's creating pain and suffering. And so the only way to loosen that up is to allow, again, this upsurge of the inexplicable, the excess. The thing, excess is kind of a placeholder for, because no word is going to be sufficient for this, right? So, yeah, I think there is a connection there.
Any further comments, questions, interventions?
Here's one.
Oh.
You had said earlier on that you made a comment to the effect that you were the one virtue of turning to phenomenology and maybe mischaracterizing what you were saying, but if I recall, one virtue of it was that it made you to maybe circumvent the critique of the subject in post disruption. Can you comment on that one?
That's not exactly what I was saying. I was saying that if one is going to think phenomenal. The question had to do with the role of the subject and post-structuralism and phenomenology. And I was saying that if one wants to think phenomenologically now, one has to take on board some of the critique of the subject from post-structuralism and those things. It can't be that kind of, so you probably noticed in a number of these things, I keep arguing against the notion of a pure something somewhere that can't be incorporated into a system or bureaucratized or sold to somebody, right? It seems to me there is no such thing. They're looking for an outside to the system. It's exhausted itself, you know? The system is, in that sense, everywhere. But even though the subject is constituted, this gets into the other aspect of phenomenology, which is the access to transcendentality. I think every human, concrete human, is not just a concrete human. We also have the capacity to perceive an open space, which is beyond ourselves, but which we have access to. It's not a transcendental ego, but it is something beyond constituted worlds. We haven't talked about this part of the book up to this point, but you might see the connections. So I think the last part of the book is a suggestion that philosophy needs to become comparative in a certain sense, to show where within different cultures there is access to a kind of a universality, which is not, again, it's not the kind of thing you write down a sentence, you know, and say everybody agrees on this, but it is the notion that we see ourselves as constituted and therefore as limited. All of us as concrete egos or Canadians or members of the 21st century, however you want to, we're limited insofar as we can see how we're constituted. Now, in order to see how we're constituted, we have to have, however you want to phrase it, and there are in different traditions many different languages for this, but you have to be able to step outside it to some extent. So I gave some talk somewhere, and a fellow came up and started to talk to me about Buddhist philosophy afterwards. And I think that's, in some sense, you know, given the translatability of languages and so on, yeah, I'm talking about something very much like that as well. And I think phenomenology was, except it got caught up in a certain 19th century Germanic philosophical language that so it was hard to see. So I think we're all, my answer is yes, post-structuralism, Lacan, all of that is right to the extent that as concrete subjects, we're always all constituted by many, many things that both enable us and limit us.
Willow, could you just wait for the microphone? Yeah, great.
Thank you for this, for the presentations, and I'm very interested in reading your book. Listening to the commentators, what resonates to me is almost a return to the old Hegelian problem of abstraction, right? I think of Hegel's text, Who Thinks Abstractly? And so I'm curious to know a little bit more about your inspiration for turning to Marx. Maybe I don't need so much of an explanation, but I'm curious about more why you would think about bringing Marx and Hegel together to return to this problem of abstraction in the contemporary condition and not perhaps another phenomenologist. So can you say more about why you wanted to bring these two thinkers together, and if I'm correct with my suspicion that it's a return to the problem of abstraction but in contemporary day situation?
Nice to see you, Willow. This is a great opportunity for me to say that there are numerous polemics against Hegel in the text, and it's not in any sense a Hegelian text. which is why I talk about Marx, though he is very influenced by Hegel. I think ultimately because of some of what I said about his late ontology, he's not a Hegelian. And I completely agree with the critique of when in the 1930s, when the 1844 manuscripts of Marx became available publicly, and also the German ideology. These are texts now which people read as if people all along knew about them, but they didn't until the 1930s. It was quite, nearly 100 years later. They played no part in the formation of what we can think of as Marxism, or classical Marxism. So yes, in them there is a strong sort of interpretation and setting aside of Hegel. But, and you are absolutely right that it is the question of abstraction that drives the whole book. But it's Husserl's analysis of the distinction between generalization and formalization, which I don't think is there in Hegel, and actually produces at least one systematic confusion in Marx. There's a category which people can't place. I can't improvise that at the moment because it's a minor part of the book. But Marx doesn't have a way of talking about abstraction that isn't a kind of up to exchangeability and value. He doesn't have a way of talking about that. And I think that's probably due to the Hegelian legacy. So, yeah, some important developments in mathematics after Hegel that find their way into Husserl enable us to work this out.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions, comments? Yeah, Quentin?
Hello. Regarding the inability for Marx's ability to quantify these abstractions, there's a guy named John Baudrillard. He's Marxist, and he supplemented the exchange market and use value of Marx with a thing called sign value, which is inherently unstable and kind of irrational, yet it does have pervasive effects all over the place. It's like the reason why someone would be willing to pay $80,000 for a Rolex that does the same use as like a $10 timepiece, and why people would willingly pay for fake and wear them proudly, fake Rolexes, because the sign value is what transcends its other forms of value. Is any of this useful, or is this in the book? Or, I don't know.
No, I don't have anything to say about Baudrillard there, just because of the way it was formulated as a text. But there is the same problem in semiotics, that from Saussure on, which is what Baudrillard builds upon, and all those, Derrida as well, build upon that Saussurean notion of a sign system. A sign system in which no sign is inherently connected to its object, right? But is connected to the system of signs. This is exactly the same as commodities, right? A commodity is not, the price of a commodity is not connected to the commodity, but to the relative prices of all other commodities. So it's exactly the same problem, and the reason it's exactly the same problem is because this is the kind of hidden force that is driving our world, as Andrew was, I think both of these guys were saying as well. There is this is a problem. And to say how and exactly why, well, that's a difficult one, but our society and our position in history is that we are driven by sign systems which aim at autonomy. That is to say, they aim at not being rooted anywhere. And so the importance of Marx and Husserl, from my point of view anyway, is that they show that this process of trying to autonomize a sign system can't ever be thorough. It can't ever be complete, right? So that the Gödel's incompleteness theorem can be put in here too. The science system always will have contain truths that it cannot express and not be able to express the completeness of itself.
It's magic.
Yeah? Okay.
I think Hilda was also alluding to this in terms of a certain kind of disconnect between the theory and praxis of Lacanian psychoanalysis, but it's also there in the theory insofar as it presupposes Saussurean theory of the sign as a formal system.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Is the microphone? Oh, no, sorry. There's a question there first. Sorry.
Take your time.
No, please. Yeah, I mean, she's already spoken. I didn't see that.
Thank you for the presentation, and so I'm very happy to hear the Chinese.
I don't think it's turned on.
Okay.
I can't hear
okay.
you.
So my question is, it's very inspiring to hear the professor says like there is always a surplus production that is the basic premises of like capitalism. So actually my question is like, is the intrinsic value in what an individual produces or the individual itself? Because my question is this: if what is valuable is basically what is valuable of production is in the productivity, there is a problem of equivalence and indiscernibility. Basically, that what a person produces and what a technology produce will be you cannot tell them. They're equivalent. Like you cannot. It's like then it's like because it is related, and then you will see the Heideggerian problem about like the Heideggerian problem of inframing. It's like things, right. Yeah, things will be reduced. The productivity will be reducible, or at least be achieved by like technology, because you cannot tell the difference from each other. And even now, we can see just recently like open AI, like even art. If Heidegger like is still alive today, like, he will be pretty sad about it. Is that even art? Like is something like the production of art can be like achieved, and you cannot tell them apart like through technology. And then there is the problem that I'm concerned with the practical problem of Professor's book, because like we all know that Marxism aims for a world that is a better world for humans. So it's like because like it's also related to what like Professor Willow said about the master-slave dialectic. Mm-hmm. It's like because like no matter it is a Marxism or it is like a Hegelian, it always presumes like interdependence and irreplaceability in production. It's like people like the person who is exploited and the person who employed, like they depend on each other, they rely on each other, even and they hurt each other. But if we value productivity instead of the individual who produces, and the individual is replaced, and basically that we are basically alienated completely out of the chain of production. It's like what can we still do about what's the practical meaning of our endeavor? And I also want to point out is like if what we value is individual, is like intrinsically value individual requiring valuing the productive process. Basically, that it is not about the product, even the artwork we produce, but the productive process. It's like the phenomenology in working in the individual well implies intersubjectivity. Basically, it's like I'm not.
Can I ask you to come to your question?
Yes. So I'm basically trying to. It's like. I'm so sorry. So it's like my question would be like, when you say that there is a surplus production, are we about the intrinsic value of it? Are we valuing the individual who produces, or what the individual produces?
Okay.
Because it will have different implications. Very different.
Thank you.
Sorry, what the individual produces?
Yes.
Or
the individual.
Or the individual.
All the individual process of all the productive process of the individual.
I'm not sure if I grasped the question exactly, but I noticed. I mean, you seem to be agreeing. You mentioned Heidegger and so on, and the notion that all forms of human experience are in some sense enfolded in a technological realm.
would say it is more like it is endeavor. It's like you can do it, basically because like it's not a metaphysical question. It's like a practical. You can do it, and we see it happening everywhere. It's like basically is that if a machine and a human can both produce the same product,
Right.
if we intrinsically value what we intrinsically value is the product itself. Like we cannot really distinguish them. The problem of equivalence.
No, we can't. And in fact, Marx's theory of value, or explanation of the regime of value, shows that if something can be produced at a smaller, more efficiently, let's say, that is to say with less expenditure, it will tend to predominate over the greater expenditure, and so over the long term, this is why human labor is continually being pushed out for automation. And actually, there's something you raised too about the digital, which I didn't respond to. But this is something which is, I think everybody knows at this point, well underway in our society, and there is no intrinsic endpoint to that. There is only if there is only the possibility of movements which say, or individuals even who make choices that say, well, I can buy a table that's produced and is, and works and so on, or I could get somebody who's a carpenter to make me a table, and this table, the second table, might well be more meaningful to me. But this is possible, and people do this, I think, all the time, but it doesn't affect the social determination of value at all. And in fact, it's quickly recuperated into various forms of elite production. Kind of like, there's a word for that, but I've forgotten what it is. Forms of things that are nicer than they have to be, and people are willing to pay lots more money just because prestige value, that's it. Yeah.
Professor, but it's not a case in the underdeveloped countries.
Oh, sure it is. You think that in underdeveloped countries that doesn't happen?
Professor, it happens.
There was a guy in Argentina run over by a car because he was walking across the road, talking into a cell phone. When they went to pick him up, they found out it was a piece of plastic. It was not a real cell phone. He had the prestige value of having a cell phone without having a cell phone. And that's, I'm not pick on Argentina, but I'm saying that goes on all over the place.
Oh, Andrew, yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
And then Glenn.
I'm not. I have hand up. Perhaps something that is relevant to the questioner. I think, if I understood, part of what you're concerned with is the fact that with AI, for example, you can produce artwork, so there's no longer any need for artists. They can be replaced. Generally, it seems like technology can replace human creativity. Is this part of your concern?
So my concern is, if you see my concern is the feminist concern, is that if we don't value the person intrinsically, there is essentially a problem.
Well, yes, I agree with that. But I don't think that has been changed by technology. People were undervalued for different reasons in every phase of history. So I'm not sure I see the connection to technology. But it's okay. We can let someone else try.
Okay, so we move on. Glenn?
Okay, yeah, thank you all so much. It's great to be back in the live arena. I've got two questions, and I hope they're relatively, I can ask them fairly quickly. The one has to do with the idea of excess, which Ian thought was an important part of the book, and I'd like to just get more clarification on it, if possible, in terms of, so my interpretation, what I hear in what all of you have said is, and particularly what Ian said there, is that this excess has to do with some quality of individuality or eccentricity or a unique imprint that we have that systems and formalizations are not able to capture. Okay, so that's a question based on my interpretation. Am I on the right track? And the second is sort of baldly or bluntly, to use your word, is the notion of the transcendent or the transcendental an important piece in your argument? Like, why do you need that?
Okay, first question was excess. What about it?
Yeah. Well, can you say a little more about that? Because what I was hearing
individual. No,
yeah.
I don't think it's individual. An individual, no. I think it's just a characteristic of humans and of nature, and that I think I'm satisfied with showing that it seems to be operative. I also have another argument about culture and the origin of culture, basically coming through the negation of labor, the privative negation. So whatever is not necessary labor is culture, at the beginning, as it were. Not that there is ever a beginning, but so, and I got that from Carol Kosik. And so culture works because of excess. And it also produces its own excess. Yeah.
Is
I don't
excess...
know if I'm saying the right kind of thing you're interested in.
Fair enough. Is excess a synonym for you for natural fecundity? What does the concept of excess
plus
add?
Human surplus productivity equals excess.
Okay, got it.
So excess is the fundamental ontological category for me, which means that no thing is just what it is, really. If you want to, the question of ontology is what is, right? What is? And I'm starting off with the question of human ontology and ontology of labor. But then I'm trying to say that we can through that see what humans share with being outright, or nature.
That's clear to me now what you're getting at there. Yeah. And the second question was about
If I could just say, I see previous phenomenological Marxisms as looking for the essence of the individual thing, and I'm saying, really, the individual thing it's only a piece. What really happens is that surging up excess, which allows individual things to happen. So, with regards to the previous question, it is very close at certain points to the kinds of questions that Heidegger asks. However, these are not Heideggerian answers to those questions.
Second question was about...
That is important to me, for various reasons that have to do with Heidegger.
Sure. The second question was about the importance of transcendentality to the argument in the book.
Is it essential to what we've been saying here? It's hard for me to say. I got into this because I had been bothered by the fact that Husserl never finished this wonderful book, The Crisis in the European Sciences, which I'm convinced is one of the great books of the 20th century, and it was left in fragments, it wasn't finished. And then you look at everybody who reads it and they tell you what he said, and that's it, and they go away home. No phenomenology seems to want to take a step beyond that to say, let's start here and see what happens now. So I structured my book around finishing what I think his book should have been, right? When you write, you have to take on a certain narrative. It's like that. It's kind of unavoidable. So could I have split it up and take this part away from that part? I don't really know. But I suspect not. I suspect that really it's this ontological excess that explains culture, which therefore, I do say this in the book, which therefore explains the possibility of the transcendental reduction.
Thank you.
which is a problem of knowing, not a problem of being. Right?
So Hilda, and then I'm wondering if it's almost time to commence the reception, which is going to happen back there now.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I don't want to come across that I am criticizing what I believe it contributes to the problem of that you are referring, the access, all these things, ecological questions, digitality, etc., or technology. I just want to clarify that I don't want to say that Lacanian psychoanalysis should be kind of criticized just for the sake of it. I think it brings something very important into the table. Just listening to you, Ian, for example, when you said the excess comes from nature, that could be read as very naturalistic, right? I mean, that excess is mediated by a whole apparatus of linguistic nature, and psychoanalysis is precisely trained to really track those sort of transmission, because the problem with excess is that it's nonsensical. And psychoanalysis precisely follows that sort of transmission of the nonsensical, that is a negativity with a positive sort of thing. So I just wanted to sort of bring some aspect that psychoanalysis can contribute, and its, let's say, its object, its jouissance or excess, the excess of psychic energy, it can be sort of, the nonsensical can be historically like the accursed share of Bataille, trying to see what can be said or how can be defined contingently in a saying, for example.
Yeah, this relates to the question also about the individual and so on. If you think about the fact that a frog is an indicator species for the health of a lake or a swamp, right? But, so you have to have frogs, and when the frogs start to die, you know, the whole ecosystem is tipping and it's dying. But there, you know, Harry Smith, frog number 234, doesn't have to live. And in fact, natural systems all the time, you know, there are more frogs born than need to live. These, you know, these birds have got to eat something, right? So the fecundity of nature, the excess, does not value the individual. Don't know if I have any more to say about that now.
I wonder if we could just translate what Hilda was referring to as a sort of nonsensical aspect of excess in terms of the idea for excess to be truly excessive. It would actually have to transcend its own concept. That is to say, it would be non-identical with itself, you know.
Yeah.
And then the ontological status of that then becomes a question. You know?
Why?
Because it's beyond its own conceptual capture. It's beyond remainder. Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's going to turn into something completely different.
Yeah.
Does it?
But it can't be nailed down, in this sense.
All right. Yeah.
Anyway, I'd just like to then thank you all for coming. Thank Ian for his responses and Andrew as well. So. Very interesting evening. And there's
Thank
food
you
in the
for your
back.
questions.
We can continue on the discussion informally. Yeah. Good.
So you did. You said you were going to have trouble explaining that in 15 minutes. I thought you did a pretty good job. It is a tough one.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of people, you really explain why it matters. You know, it's really very good.
Some people got it.
it's a shame that we couldn't attend. I would like to hear what you have to say about it.